Hello, my name's Roddy, and in this video we'll look at how Scotland's relationship with Scottish and British identity has changed over the centuries. In particular, why Scottishness has become so dominant over Britishness in recent decades, and how this has affected our nation's politics, examining the views of different historians, politicians and commentators along the way. I hope you enjoy. Quote, "Hath not God first united these two kingdoms both in language, religion, and similitude of manners? Yea, hath he not made us all of one island, compassed with one sea, and of itself by nature so indivisible as almost those that were borderers themselves on the late borders cannot distinguish, nor know, nor discern their own limits." Unquote. King James VI of Scotland and First of England, the House of Commons, March 1604. High upon Abbey Craig looms the Wallace Monument, Scotland's most potent symbol of nationhood, with the 2011 UK census having confirmed that 62% of Scots identify as Scottish only, compared with only 18% who continue to identify as Scottish and British. One could be forgiven for thinking that the monument, so explicitly Scottish, must surely be a recent creation, born of this new surge in Scottish identity. Perhaps even a contemporary of the infamous Mel Gibson effigy, Freedom, which once sat at the foot of Abbey Craig. In fact, the Victorian monument was erected in 1869, when British identity was at its high watermark in Scotland. Britishness versus Scottishness was not a zero-sum fixture. One did not inevitably diminish as the other strengthened. In fact, it's perhaps the arch-unionist Sir Walter Scott who can most surely be credited as being the genesis of the resurgence in the romantic Scottish identity enjoyed in the 19th century, and which is still felt to this day. Although it's true to say that some Scots in the late 1700s would readily have referred to themselves as North British, this was to be a short-lived phenomenon. Few make better sense of the historic duality of the Scottish-British identity than historian Sir Tom Devine, who emphasises that the 18th and 19th century Scot gained their value system and their understanding of the world around them from the pulpit of the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. They received their schooling from the Church of Scotland, they received their poor relief and their medical relief from the Church of Scotland, they settled legal matters through Scots law, they fought for king and empire in distinctly Scottish regiments. Their Scottish identity was enshrined in them from cradle to grave. Devine also explains that, given the laissez-faire nature of the British state during the earlier centuries of union, Scots' day-to-day lives were largely governed at the level of their Scottish Borough Council, and despite the limited role of central government, it was also not unknown for Scottish ministers to occasionally propose Scottish legislation to be voted on exclusively by Scottish MPs, and therefore, broadly speaking, Scots lived in what was a de facto semi-autonomous nation. In the words of Devine, quote, "The Scots actually continued to run Scotland," unquote. At the same time, Scots were perhaps the most enthusiastic Britons of all, having grasped the opportunities born of union with both hands, acting as the military spearhead and pioneering merchants at the cutting edge of the imperial venture, consequently enjoying a quite extraordinary share of the economic and political spoils of empire. As Sir Tom Devine puts it, quote, "By any criterion, with a Scottish population broadly of 1 in 10 Britons, Scotland was massively overrepresented in most of the key administrative, professional, governmental, merchanting aspects of the imperial project." Unquote. So, given that the Scot of yesteryear so embraced their dual identity, why is it that the modern Scot is so reticent? In her work Acts of Union and Disunion, What Has Held the UK Together and What Is Dividing It, English historian Linda Colley cites the three most central pillars of Britishness, once responsible for binding the peoples of Britain together as one, as being Protestantism, warfare, and empire, before asserting her views that such pillars have now all but crumbled into dust. The importance of Protestantism to Scots reduced tremendously over the course of the 20th century, and moreover, the existential threat posed to Protestant Britain by aggressive European Catholic powers had evaporated earlier still. Furthermore, the shared experience of total warfare against a common enemy, be it Napoleonic France, the Kaiser's Germany, or the Third Reich, had ended after the establishment of post-war continental peace and cooperation, and of course, for better or worse, the end of empire stripped the Scot of their prominent role in that common British endeavour. Sir Tom Devine adds one final thought to the Colley theory, which is to highlight that Scots, unlike the English who identify very closely with their imperial past, seem to have suffered, quote, a very serious case of amnesia, unquote, regarding theirs, for reasons not immediately clear to him, and therefore feel very little sense of shared imperial history with their neighbours to the south. Scots tend to remember that they gave the world the lyrics to A Man's a Man for All That and Freedom Cmollie. Few recall they also gave the world the lyrics to Rule Britannia. The stitching may have come loose in the mid-20th century, but the first signs of division did not appear until 1979. It is a great irony that the woman so often likened to Boadicea in Britannia after her victory in the Falklands should so singularly be responsible for the decay of Britishness in Scotland. I speak, of course, of Margaret Thatcher. Thatcherism, for right or wrong, and despite its wild popularity in England, was rejected time after time in the ballot boxes of Scotland, as Mrs. Thatcher wrote in her autobiography, The Downing Street Years. Quote, there was no tartan Thatcherite revolution. That may seem strange, for Scotland in the 18th century was the home of the very same Scottish Enlightenment which produced Adam Smith, the greatest exponent of free enterprise economics till Hayek and Friedman, unquote. Smith may well be the greatest Scot who ever lived. Indeed, his bust can be found in the Wallace Monument's Hall of Heroes, but Smith meant very little emotionally to the everyday life of the late 20th century Scot, not least in comparison to the industrial community to which they belonged, a community which the deindustrialization of the 1980s would soon strip them of. As Sir Tom Devine puts it, by the very nature of a partnership of unequal nations, Scotland was in bed with an elephant, though this had been of no consequence up until 1979, when said elephant had been confined to its side of the bed. In the 1987 general election, with the promise of a poll tax in the Conservative Party manifesto, Thatcher received a dismal 24% share of the Scottish popular vote, yet Scotland was to be the first area of the UK saddled with a hated poll tax all the same, albeit, ironically, at the behest of Thatcher's naively well-meaning Scottish lieutenants. As commentator Dr. Jerry Hassan explains in Ian McWhirter's sensational three-part documentary, Road to Referendum, quote, in the 80s, initially, I'm a believer in British Labour. I don't really see myself as politically Scottish. I think, for myself and a whole host of people, 87 brought us into a political awareness about being Scottish, unquote. In his fantastic BBC documentary, Thatcher and the Scots, Alan Little describes how the advent of Thatcherism crystallised the divisions in Anglo-Scottish politics. Quote, the old British politics of left versus right, Labour versus Tory, the state versus the market, were giving way to something new, England versus Scotland, with the Conservative Party being seen more and more as the English party, with a set of values that weren't just alien, but actively hostile to what Scotland wanted, unquote. Thatcherism also brought about a decline in Britishness via much less conspicuous means. Mid to late 20th century Britons had a shared experience of everyday life. They travelled on the nationalised trains of British Rail together. They worked for nationalised industries, such as British Coal and British Steel together, and together they received their utilities from nationalised bodies, such as British Telecom and British Gas. The mass privatisation which occurred during the Thatcher and Major years brought all this to an abrupt close, opening the floodgates to globalisation and an end to the shared British experience. The same principle can be applied to the curtailing of the trade unions post-miners' strike, 1984 to 1985. For decades upon decades, class-conscious British workers were united in the common cause of advancing the conditions of the collective British proletariat, as Alan Little puts so eloquently in his documentary. Quote, the British Labour movement, with its pantheon of working-class heroes and its proud tradition of organised struggle, was one of the pillars of Britishness. If you were a Scottish miner, being part of all this connected you very powerfully to Derbyshire and Yorkshire and South Wales. It pulled you in and made you identify very strongly with the community of interest that was absolutely British. When Mrs. Thatcher defeated the miners, all that was swept away. Part of what bound us all together as fellow Britons, with shared traditions and causes in common, slipped into history, unquote. Echoing the views of Donald Dewar himself, Conservative MP Michael Gove argues in Thatcher and the Scots that it was the Scottish rejection of Thatcherism and clear desire to move the nation in a different political direction to that of the rest of the United Kingdom which ultimately gave rise to the need for a Scottish Parliament. Quote, Margaret Thatcher and Donald Dewar were, together, the godparents of the Scottish Parliament. Unquote. In this globalised world, it is unlikely that the everyday lives of those who live within these islands differ greatly in terms of a north-south divide. Personal identity must surely be shaped more by Western popular culture, whether a person is young or old, rich or poor, urban or rural, than anything else. However, Dr. Jerry Hassan perhaps picks up on what is the real point of division, which is that there has unquestionably been an increase in, quote, political awareness about being Scottish, unquote, and indeed a distinct blossoming in recent times of an English political awareness, stemming from that same loss of British political awareness and the old common endeavours of Britishness. Such divisions were made strikingly apparent throughout the second decade of the 21st century. In the 2017 UK general election, the Conservatives and Labour would win 87.5% of the votes in England and 98.3% of the seats, yet would win just 55.7% of the votes in Scotland and 33.8% of the seats. In the 2016 European Union referendum, every single one of Scotland's 32 local authority areas voted to stay within the Union, whereas 8 out of England's 9 regions voted to leave. The previous year, Scotland elected just one Conservative MP in the 2015 UK general election, whereas England elected 319, and in 2014, 45% of Scots used the independence referendum to vote to end political union with the rest of the United Kingdom. However, although the role of Scottish political identity has certainly strengthened in recent decades, political historian and biographer David Torrance is quick to emphasise that Scottish political identity in itself is nothing new. Speaking on his work Standing Up for Scotland, the Scottish Unionist Party and Nationalist Unionism, 1912 to 1968, Torrance highlights the success enjoyed by the Scottish Unionist Party in the early to mid-20th century by branding themselves, quote, the guardians of Scottish identity, unquote, citing the example of their sweeping success in the 1951 general election by propagating the narrative that, quote, Labour's nationalisation agenda was anti-Scottish. It was robbing Scotland of autonomy, of distinctiveness, unquote. The latter success of the Scottish Labour Party, and eventually the Scottish National Party, would similarly be built upon the narrative that they were the parties who were truly committed to delivering for Scotland and Scotland's interests, a narrative which every Scottish party with ambition in the 21st century has felt inclined to embrace. What differentiates the politics of the age of the Scottish Unionist Party with the modern day is the lack of British identity and British political awareness as a counterbalance. The difference in political identity between Scotland and the rest of the UK has had and will no doubt continue to have profound effects. This is precisely the reason why it is so important we understand the causes behind the decline in the dual British-Scottish identity. The extent to which the Scottish regarded themselves as chiefly Scottish or chiefly British, or explicitly one or the other, is something which has waxed and waned throughout the 3 centuries of Union, but it has never ceased to be relevant. Not when Scots waved Union flags on the Royal Mile to celebrate victory in Europe in 1945, not when Scots waved saltires on the Royal Mile to celebrate the arrival of Bonnie Prince Charlie in 1745. Indeed, King James VI's pioneering sense of Britishness in 1604 would be the first step towards the establishment of the British state itself in 1707, such is the power of identity. To fail to understand it in its direction of flow is to fail to understand the very political landscape of Scotland.